Okay, so we reach where 70 AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed. There was a rebellion, and the Romans came and they leveled Jerusalem to the ground, including that sacred temple. And a lot of the Jews, the Messianic Jews who followed the Messiah, the real Messiah, Jesus, they also, other Israelites, a lot of them went to Alexandria. Not only Alexandria, but Alexandria is very critical in Christian history. So, apart from these Messianic Jews who actually were still Torah believing, Jews, but they accepted the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, we call him. The only difference between them and the other so-called orthodoxy, which was the mainstream Israelites that they lived among, was that they did not believe Jesus was the Messiah. While these Messianic, why they call them Messianic, was that they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And so his interpretations and his teachings was centered on the Torah and interpretations of the Torah and not the Talmud, right? That the Pharisees were also teaching. And hence, when all of that was gone, and now a lot of them went to close to the end of the first century AD, these groups started to grow because Alexandria was a very thriving, also cosmopolitan city. And as such, the Jews had a very comfortable, wealthy existence in Alexandria, like other people as well. And apart from these two, you also had the Pauline community, that where Paul was also converting a lot of Gentiles, and we know that the word Gentile literally means non-Israelite. A lot of them was also coming into a belief in Jesus that Jesus and James never taught. That Jesus came to die for the sins of humanity and all that good stuff, which we discussed already, right? So you had this Pauline brand of Christianity. You had, and which existed mainly among the Gentiles, that Hellenized culture, that Greco-Roman culture and whatnot. And this is where the term Christian first appeared, was that the enemies of the church of Antioch called them Christian. So Jesus never named his religion Christianity. His followers were not called Christians, but this is where it appeared. Okay. Fast forward now to Alexandria after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. You also had this Trinitarian concept of Christianity that was also in parallel growing as well. So you had that Messianic group, and in Alexandria, especially in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, or 3rd and 4th century, you had a bishop by the name of Arius. And Arius, he was the leader of what you call the Arian movement. So you could say that he became the leader of the movement who continue in that Israelite messianic tradition, that God is one, Jesus was a prophet of God, and continue to follow the Mosaic laws and that kind of stuff. And in parallel with Arius, there was a Trinitarian leader who was led by a man by the name of Athanasius. Athanasius was also, I believe he was a Greek bishop, also in Alexandria, who was the leader of the Trinitarian church. So here it is, you have these two messianic, right? I don't want to call them Christian. So you had these two messianic communities, one following, that Pauline teaching that really started with Paul, and then the other one that was continuing in the tradition of Jesus and James and the earliest followers of Jesus, right? The Nazarenes, following the prophet from Nazareth. That's where the word Nazarene essentially came from. So we're talking now the 3rd and 4th century. While these Jesus movements were growing, these was not the only two. You had more, right? You had more. But these in Alexandria, these were the two main ones, the Unitarian and the Trinitarian. And they were basically in conflict with each other. Now, in the early part of the 4th century, the Roman emperor, his name was Emperor Constantine. Right? And Emperor Constantine, I'm just going to kind of like, for brevity, skip through a lot of the details. By the time he inherited the Roman Empire, it was already, splintered, and the western part of the empire, it was like falling apart. It was burning down and all that kind of stuff. He even moved the seat of the emperor to Constantinople, which is in modern day Turkey. He named that city after himself, called Constantinople, which I think is in present day Istanbul in Turkey. And so, to save the eastern part of the empire, the crown jewel for the Roman Empire in Constantine's time was Alexandria. Now, what was happening in Alexandria in that time was almost like, like a civil war of sorts, where you had like these two rivaling communities, the Trinitarian and the Unitarian. And there was, a lot of conflicts that was going on between these two rivaling belief system about the same Jesus, right? Essentially. So Constantine wanted to unite his empire. So he called this council, what you call the Council of Nicaea. Nicaea is just like a small town outside of Constantinople, right? And apparently, you had these bishops deliberating, all these different people coming and talking about, what Jesus' life meant to them, whatever writings they had and such and such. And apparently, it depends on which source you read, they deliberated for a long time. Until eventually, and remember now, Constantine himself was a pagan, he was a sun worshipper. And the prevalent cult in Rome was called the Sol Invictus. The word Sol Invictus means sun worshippers. And they used to worship the sun, S-U-N sun, not S-O-N sun. And so when he endorsed Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, by imperial decree, God became three. So he endorsed the Athanasius Creed rather than the Arian Creed. And in some books it says that he had actually first endorsed the Arian Creed, but then he changed afterwards to the Athanasian Creed. So that's where now in the Roman Empire, the concept of this Trinitarian concept of God, this Christian concept of Trinity and whatnot, it became the official theology, official by the Caesar himself, by the emperor himself. And this is the church that became the dominant church, right? But the other churches, the Unitarian churches, the churches that continue to believe in the oneness of God, they still continue to exist. And you had a lot of them. You had like the Paulician, the Nestorians, the Arians. You had so many of them. But then in the 7th century, a lot of them disappeared in history. What happened to them is that a lot of them got absorbed into Islam, right? Because there was a lot of them in Syria, there was a lot of them that concentrated in the Middle East. And then when Islam came in the 7th century, right? The teachings of Islam was so similar to Jesus' original teachings that it wasn't difficult for a lot of these people to accept Islam. And so a lot of these former Unitarian Christians, right, who had some varying beliefs, there were varying beliefs, but they somehow over the time they got absorbed. And this church that became the ascendant church in Christian history was that Trinitarian church that is rooted more in Paul's teaching rather than the historical Jesus' teaching, right? And that's what survived till today, right? So that is a piece of history that is an excellent book written on this history. It's called it was written by Geza Vermes, which Geza Vermes is called by scholars, Christian scholars of the 20th century, as a doyen in scholarship. A doyen means he is the top authority, the scholar among scholars, right? That scholars turn to. Giza Worms. You could read about him on Wikipedia and read about his qualifications, highly decorated. He's no longer, I think he died in like 2013 or something like that. And he wrote a book, which I believe all really Christians, who want to learn about Christian history should learn about. It just as a historian, I'm not telling you to read his book to become a Muslim. It's just to learn about the actual history of Christianity. And the book is called From Nazareth to Nicaea, from 30 AD to 300 AD. How this Jew, son of a carpenter, became the third person in the Trinity. What happened? What happened between this man who was just a normal Jew? He was the son of a carpenter, right? And people recognized him as such. And suddenly he became a divine being, third in a divine Trinity. What transpired from 30 AD to 300 AD?
Quick question.
Okay.
You said Jesus was just a Jew or an Israelite? You said he was
A Jew, as I explained to you before, a Jew is a Judahite. Judah was one of the sons of Israel. Israel was a man. Jacob was his name originally, who God called Israel. Israel had 12 sons. Judah was the first son. Judah lived in a land called Judea. His descendants, lived in a land called Judea. So there was Judea and Palestine, where the 12 tribes lived. But the Judahites, the unique way that they practiced the Mosaic religion, it was called Judaism. So Moses never named his religion Judaism. Judaism is really a term mostly applied to the Judahites. And Jesus himself was a Judahite from the tribe of Judah, right? And when Nebuchadnezzar, that Assyrian king 600 years before Christ, came and invaded that region, he expelled 10 tribes, and 2, like Judah and part of Benjamin, was taken into captivity in Babylon, where they spent 70 years. And then I believe the other king, and another king I believe was Cyrus the Great, I believe. He came, the Persian king, and conquered Babylon, and he allowed these Judahites, these Jews who were taken in captivity for 70 years, allowed them to go back and live in their ancestral land. And as such, when Jesus came, 600 years after, those were the people. The other tribes never came back, right? Up until Jesus' time, they never came back. So there was essentially, the Judahites was there. So that's why Jesus, he had 12 disciples that he commissioned them, and he says, go to these 12 tribes of Israel. He says, I'm not sent except only unto the lost tribes of Israel, the lost sheep. Why? Because they never came back. They were dispersed and distributed among the nations like Persia and Afghanistan. In a matter of fact, the word Afghanistan came from the grandson of Saul, was one of the great kings in Israelite history. He had a grandson named Afghan before the land was called Ghor, Ghor. And this Afghan person, he went and settled there. So when the Jews was persecuted, they know that the grandson of this great king Afghan went and settled in that land. So the word Afghanistan means land of the Afghan people. So that's why even in Afghanistan today, you can still find remnants of Israelite Jewry, like Israelites in reality, that live there, because there's grave sites that has the Star David on it and tombstones. And these grave sites, they face Jerusalem, not Mecca, right? And I understand there was a documentary that was made by a Jewish professor of the University of Toronto called Quest for the Lost Tribes, where he spent, and even the government of India did a documentary years ago to prove that even in Kashmir, a lot of ancient Israelites went to the northernmost part of India called Kashmir. And the Kashmiri people is unlike any other people in India. And a lot of the way the women dress, the utensils that they use, the foods they cook, the name of the tongues. There's an excellent book on this history by Holger Kirsten called, Jesus in India. It was written, I think, like either in the 80s or the 90s. Well-researched book by this German scholar. His name is Holger Kirsten. Excellent book that you could read on this history as well. And also for that first 3 centuries of Christianity, which is essential to learn about the actual history of Christianity, how it changed over the course of time from what Jesus taught to what became, remember Constantine wanted a universal religion. The word Catholic means universal. So Caesar passed into Pope. The Pope became the Vicar of Christ, right? So he's not just an earthly king. He's Christ's representative in this world. He's the Vicar of Christ, right? So he had even more authority than the kings in Europe, the popes at one time, right? So this is how all of this unfolded. This is why Jesus said those Gentiles, they were dogs and swines. He referred to them as dogs because a dog always returned to the vomit and a pig always returned to the mud. So just like when he told his disciples, don't go to these Gentiles, because these very Gentiles will go back to the paganism. So Paul didn't convert Jesus' religion to Christianity or convert those Gentiles to Jesus' religion. He converted Jesus' religion to paganism, the religion of the Gentiles, right? And when you really carefully study this history, it's hard not to see this is how it unfolded. Jesus never came to start a new religion. He never said that. He never said he come to die for the sins of humanity. He said God is one. He never said God is three, right? He wasn't born on the 25th of December. His name wasn't Jesus Christ. He never wrote down no New Testament and say, hey, follow this. That old code is passed on now. Now there's a new code for you to follow. No such thing. He says if one jot or one tittle is taken out of the law, you shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. One jot is not even a letter, part of a letter. Right? But if you teach it and keep it, you'll be called great. Right? So I'm saying that there's evidence that the historical Jesus continued to follow the Mosaic religion, and he came to restore the Mosaic teachings to its pristine form, not the corrupted form that it was prostituted by these rabbis and these people who lived among pagans and developed a lot of these pagan habits and brought them into the Mosaic system. Jesus came to purify it. He was a spiritual physician healing the sickness of the Jews. They became so hard-hearted and vengeful. He said it had been said by them of old time, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, if a man smite you on one cheek, turn the cheek. Why? Because the Jews became more vengeful. When Moses said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, these Jews, they were wandering in the desert from one place to the next. They had no permanent a city or nation where they had established courts and laws and prisons. So Moses wanted laws to give them quick justice, right? Because this was a temporary application. So now Jesus came to administer to them, to teach them the part of the law that's missing, the spirit of the law, right? They was only practicing the law to the letter, but forgetting the spirit. So this is what Jesus came to do. He was a spiritual teacher, a spiritual leader, not a national leader, right? And this is the history. And I said, you can read this book from Nazareth to Nicaea, 30 AD to 300 AD, by Giza Worms. You can first read about his credentials and see that he's a highly credentialed theologian, highly credentialed Christian scholar. And this is just one book, but there are many, right? But I like to quote him because of his credentials. It's irrefutable, Anyway, I think we could stop here now.